My name is Bob Enea, and I'm born in Monterey, and my family has been here since 1905 in Monterey. And I'm here to talk about the start of the sardine fishing industry. The way the story goes, it goes back to about 1875 to the island of Sicily, in the northwest corner of Sicily. Count Pilo, who was the major landowner in the northwest corner of Sicily around the Palermo area, sent a shipment of citrus fruit, probably lemons, not oranges, but lemons, to the port of New Orleans. And he hired two men from the village of Isola della Femmine. Their names were Rosario and Pietro Aiello. And they were sent with to watch over the shipment of citrus to New Orleans. And when they arrived and delivered the shipment to New Orleans, a smallpox broke out there in New Orleans, and they ran into a fisherman from the West Coast who had told the brothers about the salmon fishing on the Pacific coast. So due to the smallpox breakout there, they left the city, and instead of returning to Sicily, they went to the west coast of San Francisco on the advice of the fishermen that they had met in New Orleans. They ended up on the Oregon coast at Astoria, where the majority of the salmon are caught there in the river, and they were there and asked if they could fish on the river, and one of the cannery owners gave them a boat to fish. So they started fishing salmon there for part of the season, and then while they were there, they learned that there was fishing in California, in San Francisco, and in Monterey. So they journeyed down the coast to San Francisco and saw the port there and how much fishing there was involved in the late 1800s, and then journeyed to Monterey and saw the port. And at that time, the fishing industry was fairly small, but controlled by the Chinese, and they were fishing squid, and the Japanese were fishing salmon at the time. So those two gentlemen returned to Sicily, and when they got back to their village of Isola della Femmine, they were asked to have dinner at the various homes of the families that were there, and they told of their adventure, and they told how the fishing industry on the west coast of California and also in Oregon was very strong, and they paid a lot of money for all the fish you can catch, which was something new to the fishermen in Sicily, because in Sicily there was a feudal system, and Count Pilo was one of an example of how the society was controlled. Count Pilo owned the harbor, he owned all the fish markets, and so the fishermen, when they brought in their load to the shore in Sicily, Count Pilo's men took the majority of the fish, and that was sold in Palermo, and then the fishermen were given a sustenance load, or just a bucket of fish, and that's how the families lived. So basically they were working for very low wages, and the majority of the fish would go to the landowners. Well, as the story goes, in one of the homes, the two Aiello brothers were invited into the Ferranti home, and a young boy at that time heard the stories. His name was Pietro Ferranti. And he heard the stories of California and the fishing and how much money they would be paid if they caught fish, and he remembered that. So, and as he grew up, he became a fisherman like everyone else in the village. And at the age of 5, he started fishing. He was given a pair of hip boots, and he fished with his father for until his teenage years. And when he was 12 years old, his mother died. And his father remarried soon after that. And Pietro Ferranti did not like his stepmother. So he asked his father if he could go live with his uncle, who lived in North Africa, and it was in Tunisia, in Tunis. The Cardinali, his uncle was Cardinali, Frank Cardinali. His nickname was Bambino, and he was his favorite uncle. So his father gave him permission to leave, and he went to live with his uncle in Tunisia and learned to fish in that fishery. They had a very strong fishery there. They would catch anchovies, sardines, and sell to the Arab markets, and the Arabs would then salt all the fish and put them in barrels. And so they made a fairly good living there, and the restrictions were very light because there was not a feudal system in effect in Tunisia as it was in Sicily. So as Pietro Ferranti grew, he became a big, strong boy, and at the age of 18, a freighter came into the harbor at in Tunis, and he learned that the ship was leaving very soon, and he decided to leave Tunisia and get on the boat and go to America, because he remembered that the Aiello brothers had told him of the fishing industry. So he did sail across the Atlantic. He worked his way across several months, and when he arrived in New York, he jumped ship and knew that he had to get across the United States to the West Coast. So he worked on a railroad. There was a railroad being built. It was not the Intercontinental, but it was a railroad from New York to the Midwest. And so he worked his way across the United States, earned enough money to buy a train ticket, and arrived in the Bay Area. And he worked his way to San Francisco, which was the main center of fishing in the West Coast then, and became a fisherman. And at this point, the time is 1889, and he was a young man of about 20 at that point. Pietro Ferranti fished in San Francisco for several years, and then learned that up the river to the east, up the Sacramento River, was a town called Pittsburgh. It was called Black Diamond at that time because there was a coal mine in the hills around Pittsburgh. There was a cannery on the river at the end of Railroad Avenue, which ended right at the harbor, right at the river, and there was a wharf and several buildings and a couple of canneries, and they were canning salmon. And one of the men who had a cannery there was named Frank E. Booth. And Pietro Ferranti began to fish for his cannery, and he eventually became the high boat on the Sacramento River for Frank Booth. So after a 10-year period, which was from 1889 to 1899, Pietro Ferranti earned enough money and returned to his home village in Sicily, which was Isola della Femmine, and he went back to claim his fiancée, and her name was Rosa Enea. And at that time, Rosa Enea had a brother whose name was Orazio, and that was my grandfather. So Pietro Ferranti married and told Rosa Enea's family that if they wanted to come to America with him, that he would take everyone who wanted to go. The whole family came with them in 1889. My grandfather's name was Orazio Enea. He married a member of the Ruccello family from Isola della Famiglia, Domenica Ruccello, and so they had a 1-year-old son named Vincent Enea, and so he and the rest of the family came to Pittsburgh and established their home in the Pietro Ferranti's house on 3rd Street, right off the river. The Enea and Ferranti families came to Monterey in 1905, and the story is this. Pietro Ferranti and Orazio Enea were fishing in Alaska. This was in June of 1905, and there was several warehouses right on the waterfront in Pittsburgh, and one of them was called the Linderberger Ice House, and that's where they brought all the fish in from the Sacramento River and cleaned them and put them in ice in boxes for shipment. They'd either put them on a steamer or trains to go to San Francisco, which was the major market. And in June of that year of 1905, there was a fire in the ice house, and the ice house burned to the ground, and the fire also spread to the wharf where all the fishing boats were tied up. And majority of the fishing boats burned to the water line or sunk, and the fishing industry in Pittsburgh at that time was devastated. On the return from Alaska, Pietro Ferranti and Orazio Enea found that their boats had burned up in the fire, and Pietro Ferranti learned that the fire department did not raise a finger to try and extinguish the fire and let the boats burn to the ground. Pietro Ferranti had a fiery temper, and he vowed never to return to Pittsburgh, and immediately took his family and left. And eventually he found Monterey, and this was in 1905, and learned that Frank E. Booth had a cannery at Fisherman's Wharf, and established contact with him and said that he would like to fish in Monterey. He saw that the possibilities were such that just by going out on the bay on a small boat, you could see a lot of fish, and you could see a lot of birds working the fish, and so that's how we determined that there was a lot of fish in Monterey Bay. So he returned to Pittsburgh and recruited my grandfather, Orazio Enea, to come to Monterey to start fishing.